Hey everybody, this is Games Plus James, and welcome back to our Unity RPG tutorial series. Now, in today's episode, we're going to take a look at showing some damage on the player. So at the moment, if we walk into an enemy, we take our damage, but we don't have anything to actually demonstrate this happening in the world. We just kind of can wander around, we don't really know what's going on. So we're going to add a couple of ways to show some actual damage happening. So it would be nice for our players to know how much damage we're taking every time we hit off an enemy or an enemy attacks us or anything like that. So we're going to do pretty much almost the same thing we did with our showing the damage numbers on our enemies when we hurt them. So instead, we're just going to make the same thing apply to our player. So we're going to open up our hurt player script here, and we're also going to have our hurt enemy script open as well. If I pop over here, yeah, I have them open here. Oh, they disappeared for a second. There we go. So we've got our hurt player script, and what we want to do is basically the exact same thing as we have here in our hurt enemy script, where what we create a clone of the damage number, which is done down here, and then we take that clone and then we give it the value of whatever damage it should take. So we just need to copy the same kind of stuff that we've done here. So we're going to do a public game object of damage number back over here. Public game object that we'll call again damage number and semicolon at the end, and then down in our line of code here that handles where our player getting hurt, what we're going to do is we're going to copy all this text from var clone here onwards down to where we're setting what should be stored in the text there. So we're going to copy that and just paste it into our hurt player here. And obviously we're going to get little bits of red here, but that's fine because we don't have a hit point set up on our player, but we know our player, whenever he's taking damage, he's always going to be in the same place. So we want this to kind of come out of the center of the player, so we know where our damage is coming from at all times, or so that we know that it's our player that's being damaged, more importantly. So here on our instead of it going to hit point that position, because we have under instantiate here, we have the object being instantiated, then the position where it goes in the world, and the rotation of it. So what we'll do is, instead of using the hit point dot position, we'll just use the other dot transform dot position. Because you remember what's happening is, this is our hurt player script, so obviously this is attached to our enemy, and when our enemy runs into something, it's doing the check and seeing what is the other thing that we're running into, and if it's the player, then we know that the other is the player. So then we can say, okay, on the player, the transform position of the player is where we can have this object instantiate. So we'll just save this, go back into the game, and in our prefabs folder, we want to make sure that our slime enemies here have the damage numbers object put into that slot that we just created. So on our slime, if you just wait for this to compile down here, there we go. If we scroll down to our hurt player script, now we have this slot here that's empty. So we're going to drag our damage numbers prefab into there. And now if we play the game, once everything gets running here, we walk into an enemy and you see we get our little damage number appearing, showing that we've taken a bit of damage. And we can attack the enemy and make him have some damage too, but that's not quite enough. We have the numbers being shown and it kind of shows the player taking a bit of damage, but that's not quite enough in our game. But we don't want to do the same thing that we're doing with our enemies, where our enemies at the moment, when we attack them, we make the numbers come up and we also do a little splash of damage, the little kind of red kind of almost blood effect. But we don't want to do the same thing happening to the player, because then it just looks like your player can get confused whether did they actually do some damage to the enemy or the enemy do something to them. So we want to do something different with the player to show damage. So what we're going to do is make the player kind of flash in and out of being transparent. So he'll go invisible, come back to real, go invisible, come back to real again, in a very kind of simple and straightforward way. So we know that anytime the player gets hurt, we have two things happening. We have our enemy, if we go to our scripts, we have our hurt player script being called. So whenever we walk into a player, that hurts whenever we walk into an enemy, that hurts the player. But then what's also happening is on our player health manager, we're taking some damage at the same time. So what we can do is use our player health manager to control our player kind of flashing and actually looking like they're taking some damage. So we're going to open up our player health manager script and go in here. And so we're going to add a couple of things here. So we want to know whether we should have our player flashing at the moment, and we'll also want to know how long our player should flash for. So let's add a couple of values up here. So we'll add a public bool for flash active, so that we know if the player should be currently flashing after they take damage or not. We'll also add a public float called flash length. So this will be how long we make our player flash for. And if we want to have our player flashing for a certain amount of time, we're also obviously going to need a counter counting down of how much flash or how much longer the flash should last for. So we're going to add a private float that we'll call flash counter. So that will be used just to count down how long our flash is lasting. So for example, when our player gets hurt here, this is our hurt player function, this is part of our script. So as soon as the player, we take some damage, which is all fine, so then we know that we want the player to start flashing on the screen. So we'll say our flash active should be equal to true. And we also know that if the player's just starting to flash, then our flash counter should be equal to our flash length, like that. So now we know that we have our flash will be lasting a certain amount of time. And before we start actually doing any more code, let's go back into the game here, and we'll just set a value for us to be kind of working with. So if we go to our player and scroll down, once this compiles here, we'll get an extra slot for our player health manager for how long our player health is lasting. So we have flash active, that actually doesn't need to be a public. We might change that back to being private because we don't need to be able to see that here. But our flash length, for the moment, let's set that to be 0.5. Okay, so we go back to our script. Like I said, we don't need our flash active bool to be public, so we'll leave that private like that because we don't need to be able to make any changes with that there. So when our player gets hurt, then we know our flash active is true and our flash counter has been set to a flash length. So we need to actually start doing something with those values. So in our update loop here, we're going to add an if statement to say, just to check if the flash active is currently true. And if that's true, then we're going to want to do some stuff. So what we'll want to do is basically the way you can make our player go invisible. If we go back in here, and if we look at a player up here, on our sprite renderer here, we can go through the color and we can change the alpha value and put it down to 0. Or if we put it all the way up, if we put it all the way up, our player is 100% solid. And if you put it all the way down, our player goes invisible. So we can take advantage of that to make our player flash in the world. So if we go back to our script, what we'll do is make it go in certain stages. So we'll have it be that our player, if our flash is active once it first starts, we'll have our player go invisible. Then we'll make him come back to being visible again, then go invisible, and then finally at the end we'll make him visible again and we'll deactivate our flash. So if we know that what we want to do at the end is deactivate our flash, we can just add a little simple if statement here to say if our flash counter is less than 0, then we should know that our flash active is equal to false, like that. And then we need to be able to actually manipulate the alpha value of our color. So if we're going to want to actually make changes to the color on our sprite render, we need to know where the sprite render is. So obviously we need to make a reference to that back up here. So we're up here, we're going to add private sprite renderer that we will call the player sprite. And then of course we need to make sure we're talking about the correct sprite render. So in our start function we will get the component. So player sprite equals get component sprite renderer, because we know that our player health manager script is attached to our player here, so it knows to find the same the sprite renderer component that is attached to the player as well. So perfect. So now that we know we have access to this down here, so we're just imagining what happens here at the end now. So at the end, we know we want our player to be have his alpha value be perfectly full. So what we can do is on our player sprite dot color, one of the limitations with how Unity handles this stuff is we can't directly make a change to the alpha value here. So we could, in an ideal world, we could say player sprite dot color dot a, because a represents the alpha value. We could set that to be equal to 1f, and 1f means it's 100% full. The way colors work within Unity is it goes from 0 to 1. Even though if we go and look at the color object here, our alpha value goes from 0 to 255. 255 is represented as 1. So basically, if you wanted to get any kind of number in between, you would have to divide by 255. So say if you wanted to get 151, you would go 151 divided by 255, which would be about 0.6, roughly speaking, looking at it there. So it's just important to remember that 1 is actually the equivalent of 255 in that slider. But the problem with this is this won't actually work. If I was to save this now and go back into the game and let this compile down here, and once it compiles, you see we'll get an error straight away because we can't actually make a direct change to A like that. So what we have to do is, instead of that, is saying player sprite.color is equal to a new color, and then in the bracket we have to fill in 4 values: red, green, blue, and alpha values. So we don't want to make any changes to red, green, or blue, so we can just say, okay, we'll just take the current player sprite dot color. Oh no, I typed the wrong thing there for a second. Player sprite dot color dot r, so that's the value for red. And then I'm just going to copy this here to save me typing again. So player sprite dot color dot g, and then finally player sprite dot color dot b. And then now this is where we can make our change to the alpha value. So here we can say 1f like that, and then our semicolon at the end. So what's happening there is we're setting it so that when our flash counter gets to 0, we're making sure that our player is 100% real, and we're deactivating this thing. So what are we going to do in between? So like I said, we want to have it so that it turns off the sprite, turns it back on, and then turns it off again. And then finally we have this bit that turns it back on the final time. So what we have is 3 separate phases before this. We have off, on, off. So if we have 3 phases, we know that we can use roughly thirds to break these numbers up. So what we can say is if our flash counter is greater than our flash length multiplied by 0.66f. So 0.66 is roughly 2/3. So what we're saying is if our current count is greater than the whole initial value multiplied by 2/3. So say if our count, if we go back in here, we have our count being set as 0.5. So roughly speaking, that's 0.333, yeah. Actually, let's just work with this with a whole number value, kind of would make it a little bit simpler. So we'll say our flash length is 1 second. So what we're saying is if our flash counter is above 0.66 of a second, then we should be currently invisible. So how do we make ourselves invisible? We'll take our player sprite setting here. So we'll just copy all of this, paste it in here, and we can say instead of 1f, we set it to be 0, so our player will go completely invisible. So this is what's handling our first phase. But then what we can do is say else if for our second phase, if our flash counter is greater than flash length multiplied by 0.33f. So this will be 1/3 of our 1 second length here. So if it's greater than 1/3 of our total length, then we'll want it to come back to being visible again. So again, we can just paste in the same thing, and we can leave it at 1f this time. And the reason this works is because in this first if statement, we're checking if it's above 2/3 of the second, and if it's above that, then we make ourselves invisible. But then once it gets below 2/3, we'll do another check to see if it's above 1/3, and if it is above 1/3 and it gets into this phase, we already know that it's below 2/3 here, so we can make ourselves visible. So then we can do a final check and say else if our flash counter is greater than 0, because we know the next third down is 0. So we can say if our flash counter is greater than 0, we'll paste the same thing in again, but now we'll put ourselves to be 0f. And then finally we have our flash counter is less than 0. But then we know that we have these three options here. So we have above 2/3, we make ourselves invisible. Above 1/3, we make ourselves back to be invisible again. Above 0, we make ourselves invisible a final time. So rather than having this extra if statement here, what we can just say is we can just delete that line completely, and we can just say else. Because we know that if none of these things are true, so basically if we're not above 0, then we know we must be either equal to or less than 0. So we know our player should go back to being fully visible, and we should turn our flash active to being false. So we'll save this, and we should, if we go back into the game now, we should see this all in action working perfectly fine. We won't leave it at 1 second length, but we'll just leave it at that for the moment to demonstrate. I might actually just up our player max health as well, just for the purposes of us testing all of this out. So I'm just going to give ourselves like 2000 health. That'll be fine. And if we hit play here now, waiting for it to load, there we go. So we walk into an enemy, there we go. We see, well, we go invisible, but we're not coming back to be invisible again. Oh, because, of course, we haven't actually made this count down. So we need to add just, actually not before all of this stuff, just after all of this stuff. After we're doing those checks to see what stage we're at, we'll just say our flash counter minus equals time dot delta time. Okay, so we'll save that, go back in here. Again, we'll let it compile and run. And once it's finished going, or finished compiling in the corner, we'll hit play here. Here we go. And if we walk into an enemy now in a second, there we go. I couldn't move there for a second for some reason. So we see, there we go. We see ourselves flash on and off when we take some damage. So we see our little damage indicator going up, and we see ourselves kind of flashing like that. But obviously 1 second is a bit slow here, so I'm just going to minimize it for a second. So we'll change our flash length down to 0.5 and see how this looks. So we walk into a bad guy again. There we go. We get a nice little flash, and we can see we've actually taken some damage, and it gives the player a little kind of visual feedback to know, okay, there's something has happened. You've gotten hurt in some way. Let's try put it at 0.25 here. There we go. We get a nice little quick flash just to demonstrate, yeah, you've taken some damage and you should try and be careful. And then when we attack an enemies, oh, I walked into the building there. If we attack an enemy, we see that they're taking a different kind of damage, and there we go. So what was happening there was we were attacking the enemy and we were getting a little bit hurt ourselves. So we could clearly see there's two different ways of damage occurring there for our player to actually understand what's going on. So there you go. That's the basics of showing some player damage and making it all look a little bit more sensible in our game. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you all very soon. Thanks for checking out this episode, and if you want even more Games Plus James goodness, make sure you hit those subscribe and like buttons. You can also find me on Twitter and Facebook by following the links on screen, where you can find out all the latest news about the channel. And if you want to help support the show, check out the Patreon page, where you can get exclusive content in return for helping make the channel even better. Thanks for watching, and stay tuned for more.